to Rising Up for Justice, a special weekly series presented by Rising Up with Sonali, an independently produced subscriber-supported program syndicated to radio stations, free speech TV, and podcast platforms. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer. Our nation and our world is overrun by billionaires and bigots, but they are few and we are many. On this series, exclusive to subscribers of Rising Up with Sonali and viewers of Free Speech TV, we'll hear from organizers in the movements for social justice and dig into the nuts and bolts of values, strategies, tactics, narratives, and building power. This week on Rising Up for Justice, Vincent Warren, Executive Director of the Center for Constitutional Rights, joins us. He's a leading expert on racial injustice and discriminatory policing and oversees CCR's litigation and advocacy work using international and domestic law to challenge human rights abuses, including racial, gender, and LGBTQIA injustice. He previously monitored South Africa's historic Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings and was a senior staff attorney at the ACLU and a criminal defense attorney for the Legal Aid Society in Brooklyn. He's done so much more, but we leave it at that. Welcome to the program, Vince.
Thank you, Sonali. It's great to be with you.
Well, I followed CCR's work, Center for Constitutional Rights work, for many, many years. It's been around since I was a journalist a couple decades ago. And there have been so many different issues you've worked on. I remember, talking to your lawyers around Guantanamo. And of course, the work evolves. But how do you summarize? Because, looking through your website, your organization does a lot. How do you summarize what the main goals are for CCR?
CCR has been around for a lot longer than from when you were a journalist or even an astrophysicist. We started in 1966, so this year is our 60th year in existence. And CCR is a legal and advocacy organization that works with communities under threat to be able to move them towards a path of liberation. And when you hear the name Center for Constitutional Rights, you would think that we only do constitutional rights, and we actually don't. What we do, is that we infuse both the constitutional rights as well as international human rights and international human rights principles into our litigation and advocacy. So we believe that if you have a lawyer, an activist, and a storyteller, you can change the world. And so we work with lawyers, we work with community and movement groups, we work with storytellers. And the litigation is very bold, it's innovative, it's experimental in some ways. The advocacy work is about building power in communities so that they can make the change that they want to see. And our work with storytellers and our strategic communications is really designed about reframing from state power narratives to framing towards people's narratives. What are the people actually experiencing? What are they actually going through? As opposed to what the government is saying is happening. So our work can be located anywhere from the ACLU to the smallest, most radical legal operation, the National Lawyers Guild, for example, that we span both of those pieces. We do two types of cases. We do what we call fight power cases, and we do what we call build power cases. And fight power cases are the types of cases that we are doing against Trump, and we did against Biden, and we did against Obama, and we did against Trump and George Bush back in the Guantanamo days. And this is where the president, the executive, the governor, the mayor does some sort of horrible policy that impacts vulnerable communities, and we file lawsuits around the constitutionality of that. But we also do what's called build power cases, and those are cases where we work with community organizations, anywhere from the smallest community group. We work with a series of small community groups in Cancer Alley, Louisiana, fighting big petrochemical companies. We work with national movements, the Movement for Black Lives, amongst many, many others. And we work with advocacy groups on the state level, on the local level, on the national level, some of which are large and some of which are tiny. But we're working with them, and we're looking for the ones that have the type of analysis that rejects the idea that power of the state or power of corporations should define the living experiences of normal people, and particularly vulnerable and marginalized communities.
And so it's not just, when you think of constitutional rights, you think, oh, this would be an organization aimed specifically at protecting people from government overreach, but it's also corporate overreach and corporate abuses. And it's not just the US Constitution here locally, but as you pointed out, there's a global angle, a global lens. That's huge. What is the scope of the organization? Give me a sense of the size of the organization.
Well, the work that we do is much larger than you would think that the number of people that we have would allow. So we're a staff of about 60 people, and of those 60, about 17 are lawyers. The rest are advocacy staff and communication staff and operations staff. And so with 60 people, we managed to do all the things, everything from, as you mentioned, being the first group to challenge illegal detentions at Guantanamo, to being the first group to challenge when George Bush was sending people to different countries, third countries, to be tortured. We challenged the entire torture regime 20 years ago, still representing some of the men in Guantanamo. We also did the stop and frisk litigation here in New York, which ended in 2013, which was a resounding trial in which the court found the New York City Police Department's practice of just stopping and frisking black and brown people because they were black and brown as unconstitutional. We ended long-term solitary confinement in Pelican Bay Prison out in California, and we have been leading in the Trump administration, the first one and the second one, filing lawsuits challenging the Muslim ban, challenging what's called public charge, which is this crazy idea that the Trump administration wants to limit people coming into the United States because it's afraid that they're going to use public benefits. And we represent Mahmoud Khalil, the Columbia student who was abducted by ICE for his political beliefs. We've just recently filed cases challenging the U.S. Targeting of fishing boats off the coast of Venezuela and Colombia in a human rights challenge. We've also filed lawsuits against both corporations that have been doing human rights abuses as well as military dictators from other countries that have ties to the U.S. That have been abusing and killing and hurting the people that were protesting against them. So
And
it's a
also
very
around
broad.
Palestinian rights.
Yes, and around Palestinian rights. Thank you. And the Palestinian work that we've been doing in terms of human rights is we've been doing that for 30 years, most recently filing a challenge against the Biden administration for aiding and abetting in the genocide in Gaza. Um, Under the Genocide Convention, this is a great way to talk about the difference between constitutional law and human rights law. The United States is a signatory to the Genocide Convention, which means that they can't aid or abet or promote genocides, and of course, they also can't turn a blind eye. All of which this country has done with respect to what's been happening in Gaza. So we filed a huge case against the Biden administration for that.
Let's talk about the way in which the CCR actually achieves your goal. I want to pick up on what you were saying earlier, that you believe that, what is it, an attorney, a storyteller, and an activist can change the world. What do you mean by that? And it sounds like your staff is basically made up of those, three kinds of organizers or three kinds of doers. How does CCR go about achieving its goals? It's clearly not through merely legal, filing lawsuits.
Yeah. So, our organization actually doesn't believe that just doing the law, just being a lawyer is going to free anybody. It does not end up in liberation. It doesn't end up in ending occupations. In this administration, that we are also seeing that it certainly doesn't stop presidential administrations from seeking to do things that are illegal. But it is a very useful tool in conjunction with other organizing tools to be able to shift the narratives and to shift the structures that are in place that allows the bad things to happen. And so we use law with an understanding that it is mostly used as a tool of oppression, and that our job is to use it creatively and imaginatively to be able to support a move towards liberation. You don't necessarily think about lawyers as liberatory movement folks, but we are. And when we think about the lawyer, the activist, and the storyteller, the lawyers do have the ability to shift the structures that keep the status quo in place, the bad things that are happening. The activists have the opportunity to shift the behaviors, particularly of those that are in power. And we look at various activist strategies. It's largely not only just protesting the bad things, but it's also shaming the elements of power and the decision makers into recognizing that it's a bad thing and changing their behavior, and that storytellers actually shift people's beliefs and attitudes. And so, what we've seen as we work in the social justice field is that those three things are often disconnected. And so, our strategy is to try to connect those things. So we're not centering the law, even though that's a lot of what we do, but we're using the law in service for the broader change that communities and that marginalized communities want to see. And the final thing is that if people just listened to the folks that are being terrorized by the state and being oppressed, if they listen to them about A, what it's been like, what is actually happening, B, why it's happening, and C, asking them, what do you think the remedy? What do you think that what solves this problem? If we listen to them, we wouldn't be in this mess. But the problem is power doesn't listen to the people that it marginalizes them. What power does is it continues to marginalize them and then criminalize them. And so part of our work is being in deep consultation with activists and organizers around community goals, what they want to see happen. And usually, what they want to see happen, there's no legal script for it. Most lawyers will say, I don't really think we can do that. But our job is to think creatively and to find ways to be able to use the law either to support their goals or to use the law to create some space for organizers to be able to think, to keep the state off their back as they develop their strategies.
What you're just describing sounds like a much more proactive approach than I think we've seen traditional lawyer-based advocacy organizations do. I think about the ACLU, and it'll usually go after, when someone's rights are being stripped, they will work to try to restore those. But in consulting with activists and asking them what their vision for justice would be and trying to realize that sounds a lot more proactive. Is that accurate?
Oh, I think that's Sonali. I think that's very accurate. Like the ACLU, I used to work at the ACLU, and I was there for a job interview years ago. And at the end of the interview, they asked you, "Do you have any questions for us?" And my question was, "Tell me a little bit about how you work with communities that you serve." And they all kind of looked around each other, and they're like, "Well, we don't really do that because the ACLU doesn't do that. ACLU's client is the Constitution. They're preserving the Constitution for everybody, which is great work. It's wonderful work. I
Right.
enjoyed
It's
it
it's its own organization, and they stay in a very specific lane and have done it very effectively for many years.
for many years. It's wonderful. What we do is different because our client isn't preserving the Constitution. Our client is social change. And so if we know that we're winning when communities have more power to be able to push back on the things that we're also fighting in court. And so when you think about the stop and frisk case, or you think about what's been happening in Minnesota, that we did sort of two different sets of work. On the stop and frisk case, we were the lead litigators. In sites of struggle, like in Minnesota and places like Ferguson, we were working with organizers to be able to provide some legal resources or even legal training or legal analysis or advice around the strategies that they're doing. So the victories that we see about ICE pulling back, if not out of Minnesota, it's the people's victory because they were so incredibly organized and they were so incredibly in solidarity. And they were taking a tremendous risk in doing that. And so part of our work was to be able to advise anyone that came to us about how they should be thinking about that risk, not to tell them that they shouldn't do it, but to say that if you do this, here are the things that are likely to happen, and here are the things that we prepare you for. So we do a lot of behind the scene sort of movement solidarity work as lawyers. And we also do some in front of the cameras work like the ACLU as well.
What are the main challenges or obstacles that you face? Not just, I mean, I'm not just talking about the fact that the reason for you doing your work is that there are big obstacles to people's rights. I mean, sort of just getting things done. It sounds like, what, 17 lawyers approximately doing such enormous work. Is that a limitation? What are some of the obstacles that you identify in your day-to-day work that you wish you could, or that you are planning on and working toward overcoming?
Yeah, the capacity is an issue for everybody in the movement, as you know. So we don't have enough people doing enough things to be able to make the kind of change that we want. And I think because the left, because social movement organizations and activists understand that if we're working alone, that we're just going to get crushed by this tremendous power that the state or corporate or corporations yield, that we're in constant discussion about how we work together. And so our big challenge, I mean, I think the movement challenge is at this particular moment is how to, number one, build alignment about what we're actually seeing from the Trump administration. Number two, to build a big enough tent so that people can, from the right who don't like what's happening, can defect to a hell no camp that would be supported by protesters and activists and things like that. And building the capacity to be able to do it effectively. So the big challenge right now, and it's frankly it's been the challenge within Trump one as well, is that they do everything everywhere all at once. They don't care about legality. In fact, that their job is to break the law because they're doing it, they're testing it, and they're seeing if we break this law this way, who's going to tell us that we can't do it? And if no one says that you can't do it, they're going to keep doing it and moving forward. So the capacity question is huge. Where is the Trump administration going to strike next? Which communities is it going to be? Right now, he's looking at big, at sort of quote unquote sanctuary cities. He's also looking at mayors who, initially, when he was talking about the National Guard, people were like, he's looking at Democratic cities. I'm like, he is, but he's also looking at black mayors. If you notice, every mayor that he was going after was a black mayor. So there's a sort of a encoded white supremacy element to their strategy. So we don't know where it's going to be. And each community has a different social justice infrastructure. So the big challenge is one, figuring out where it's going to happen next. And two, for the communities that don't have a big storied infrastructure, how can we get them support? And so we work with, we have a very broad network of friends and allies that we work with. We used to work with law firms until they capitulated with Trump. So that makes it extra hard to do the big cases because law firms are good for building capacity, even if they weren't particularly good for being sort of politically accountable. And so we're left to sort of do it on our own. And that's proving to be a huge, huge challenge. My team is stretched. Our team is stretched. We're all over the place, but we're trying to be very systematic and strategic about where we use our resources in this particular moment of authoritarian increase that could strike anywhere and is striking anywhere.
I want to focus a little bit on the storytelling aspect of CCR's work. You mentioned you have communications staff. And of course, I imagine you and your fellow lawyers also do lots of interviews like this one. What is the storytelling strategy? How do you, understanding that culture shifting is critical to advocacy work is still a relatively new-ish, trend, I think, on the left, maybe 10 or 20 years, that people have really started emphasizing the importance of building narratives and changing our culture so that the victories we win actually stick. There's buy-in from the public. So what is CCR's strategy on narrative?
Okay, I'll tell you a story about narrative. um, When we were first working in the river parishes in Louisiana, a place called Cancer Alley, this is an 85-mile stretch between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, Louisiana, which is the historic ground of sugar plantations. And so the black descendants that live there are descendants of enslaved people that have, after emancipation, were able to buy their little bits of property to band together, against 150 years of white terror, to be able to live in peace and to sort of create their own economy. One of the things that happened in the 1950s was that the descendants of the slave owners decided that they were going to sell their land to petrochemical companies. And so from the 1950s through the 1970s and 80s to now, there has been a proliferation of petrochemical companies in this stretch of land, which is largely black and largely poor, which gave black people two options to make money. One was that they also turn their plantations into museums, so you can work in the plantation economy in the museum, or you can go work for the petrochemical companies. Those were the only two options. And when we went down at the behest of a group of organizations that have been fighting petrochemical companies for years. I asked them, I said, what do I need to know about your life here? And they said, we are in this situation where we cannot leave and we can't stay. And I said, well, why can't you leave? And they said, because our great grandparents bought this land after enslavement. This is the only thing that we have, and it honors them that we stay here and we continue to do it. And I'm like, well, why aren't you leaving? And they said, well, that's why we're not leaving. But the reason why we can't stay is that we're all dying of cancer. It's the highest rate of cancer anywhere in the country. And we can't tell our kids to stay here and to raise their families here. And at the same time, we can't leave because this is our ancestral home. And it's that in that story, it talks about you hear the conundrum that so many families are facing. And you have to imagine what would life be like if the complicating factor were not the fact that the state and corporations have colluded to basically poison them out of existence. They don't build petrochemical companies in white facilities in white communities. In St. James Parish, one of our cases, that in the many, many years of building petrochemical companies, they have never once, not once, given a permit for that to be built in the white sections of the parish. So it's a story of 150 years of history, and yes, there are constitutional and environmental issues to be fought. But the real story, though, is one of human dignity. Is that how can we allow our people to be in a situation where the only way they can live in a place is to die, and by leaving, that they're actually killing the very important historical legacy that their ancestors, our ancestors, my ancestors have fought for.
Well, that's a great way to answer that question, that storytelling is so important. Now, who do you consider to be CCR's natural allies in the universe of social justice work that you do? I imagine groups like the ACLU, and obviously you, as you mentioned, you consult with and have deep ties to community organizations that in the realms that you do the legal work.
Yeah, and the ACLU is a more recent ally. For many, many, many years, the Center for Constitutional Rights and the ACLU really were not working with each other, and that stemmed from the 1950s, actually, where the founders of CCR were doing work protecting people who were communists against the McCarthy era and the policies relating from the Red Scare, and the ACLU refused to do it. And so that was a long time split. And frankly, it wasn't until I left the ACLU and came to CCR, and in 2010, we were doing a case against the Biden administration for the use of drones to kill U.S. citizens that were based in Yemen, because they said that they were saying terroristic things. And we were able to begin to work together for the first time in a long time around that particular case. Since then, we've partnered together on all sorts of things: the border asylum cases that are happening, the the case targeting the fishermen in the Caribbean that I just mentioned that we filed a few weeks ago. Those are cases that we're now working together very closely on. But we work with pretty much every legal organization, anybody from the National Immigration Law Center to movement organizations like United We Dream, to Black organizations like the National Conference of Black Lawyers. And we work with very small groups and very large groups. And so, and over the course of our 60 years, we've worked with just about every major social movement in the United States. And so the list is really super long. But I think I would say that the people that we gravitate towards, we actually don't gravitate towards the straight constitutional lawyers. We gravitate towards the radical organizers.
Well, and finally, how can people support the work that CCR is doing? Where can they find out about it? Give out the website and just any ways in which the public can get involved if they're watching and listening to this interview and think, I really want to back this organization in some way.
Yeah, so there are a number of ways to do it. So our website is ccrjustice.org. And so please take a look at the website. You'll see the broad range of work that's happening. There will be a tab there that says Get Involved. And so there are a lot of things that you can do. Our social media accounts on Instagram is also CCR Justice. We're on Blue Sky. It's good to be able to sort of see, particularly on Instagram, to be able to see the work that's happening, because sharing that with other folks, the idea is that we all need to catch courage from each other, and so that there are tremendous victories and things that are happening. So definitely hop on that and share. If you're old school like me, you go on the website, you can sign up for our email alerts. We send them about once a week. It's not super annoying. It's filled with here's kind of what's coming up this week and here's what we did last week. And it's super, super informative. And we also give tremendous credit to our partners in our press releases and other ways. And so it's a great way to find out about other organizations that are doing stuff as well.
Well, Vince, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. We'll make sure that our audiences get those links that you mentioned. Good luck to you.
Thank you, Sonali. Really appreciate it.
My guest has been Vincent Warren, Executive Director of the Center for Constitutional Rights. And this is Rising Up for Justice. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of this new weekly half-hour series, exclusive to viewers of Free Speech TV and to subscribers of my long-standing program, Rising Up with Sonali. You can find out more at risingupwithsonali.com.